If you go through that process, it's going to be super obvious where are the problem areas with your spending. If you can cut those problem areas out of your life, at least temporarily, so you can kind of catch up, then we can start to build from there.
Okay, I'm just going to pay a little bit here, and I have this tax money that's coming. I'm going to pay this off, and I'm going to try to put this money over here. And it's like, that is not working. You're spreading out a little bit around to each, and you're not making any progress that's meaningful progress, right?
Something's going to have to change. Like it's as simple as that. What you've been doing hasn't been working, and so you got to do something different.
What should you pay off first? You're going to get a bunch of answers this way, a bunch of answers the other way. But really, it comes down to what's going to keep you motivated in the long term.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Lauren and I are back for our weekly episode where we talk all things money, from getting out of debt, budgeting, investing, and all the other wild things going on in the world of finance.
Yeah, Nick, I was thinking about this as I've talked many times about my debt-free journey, but I thought maybe we could do an episode on some actionable tips to actually get out of debt. So for me in my debt-free journey, there's a lot of things that you can do as far as getting out of debt. Lots of things that people are telling you, lots of things out there on the internet. But I thought it'd be a good idea to really dive into 3 specific topics and really go over how you can get out of debt and really take these tips and put them into your life and start on your own debt-free journey. So.
Yeah, I love it. And, just to give some, I guess, to lay some groundwork before we get into what the tips are and what you can start doing for your debt. We've talked about the importance of budgeting pretty much every single episode, because I think, Lauren, you and I are big believers that every part of your financial journey, knowing what the numbers look like, being able to create a plan from that, that's going to be such a huge part of it. Getting out of debt is absolutely no different. You got to know where the numbers stand. You got to know what you're bringing in, what you should be spending in terms of your expenses, how much is left over or should be left over if you cut out all the BS spending. That way you can actually make a plan for what's left over. We're not saying you have to cut these things, but you should know what can be cut versus what needs to be paid. I think that's a huge part of it, is knowing where your money's going and then actually making a plan for it. But yeah, why don't we jump into this first tip?
Yeah, great point, Nick, about, we're not going to talk about budgeting specifically here, but these tips are contingent upon you already having a budget set up. So the first tip here we have, probably maybe not so common sense, but stop accumulating debt. Right? So if we're going to be on a debt-free journey, if we want to get out of debt, we have to stop using debt for our purchases or anything else moving forward. So, I think a lot of people are in this cycle of, using debt from month to month, maybe to, fund their lifestyle. How can they get out of that, cycle of, living sort of on their credit cards each month? How do they actually stop? And how can they break the cycle of using debt each month?
Yeah, it's a nasty cycle where you put something on your credit card and you say, okay, with my next paycheck, I'll pay it off. And then you might pay it off, but then that forces you to use your credit card again in the future. It's this cycle of just constantly being in the hole and using your current income to pay for your previous expenses. It's just, It's not a fun place to be. But in terms of breaking that cycle, that's why we said budgeting has got to be such a huge part of this, because you got to know, what are you bringing in? What do you need to be spending in terms of your expenses? What should be left over. And I think if you go through the process of creating a budget, Lauren, I think we've been pretty vocal that to create a really good budget, you should start by looking at your actual spending so you can know what the numbers really look like. If you go through that process, it's going to be super obvious where are the problem areas with your spending. Is it that you're spending too much on your, your actual living expenses? Is it the dining out? Is it the random spending? I was just talking to someone who said my spending's really not that bad. I just love to go on trips with my daughter. And it's all right, I totally get that, but that's where the problem area is. If you have leftover money, that's where it's all going. So you kind of got to figure out what are the problem areas. And then if you can cut those problem areas out of your life, at least temporarily, so you can kind of catch up, no longer needing to be in that cycle, then we're kind of at ground zero, then we can start to build from there.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like this will naturally almost happen if you're getting your money organized and you have a budget to work off of. Because I think this is the biggest thing. People are stuck in this cycle because they don't know what's coming in, because they don't know what's going out. So I think that's going to naturally happen. And if you're starting a debt-free journey and you're paying off your debt, you're obviously not going to want to keep putting debt on credit cards or taking out loans or anything like that. So I think this is sort of a natural first step, but maybe not so common sense. Like I said, I think we really have to, I think the bigger thing here is you have to understand your why you want to get out of debt, or otherwise you're not going to even attempt to do this. So I think that's also a big part of it too, which we've talked so much about as well.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite analogy is like you can't drain the tub while the faucet is still running, right? Like you got to stop the spending on the credit cards, the accumulating the debt, taking out those little micro payday loans if you want to be able to actually get in front of the debt and make a plan, right? Like you just can't do it if you're still taking on more debt. And like, I'm pretty sure I'll get some pushback on this, but like I always tell people like, look, if you've proven to yourself that you can't use credit cards, just cut them up. Like, I'm not saying you need to close out the accounts and you need to like wreck your credit or anything, but cut them up, remove them from like all of your physical wallets, your digital wallets. You know, once you build up the right habits, we can always order new credit cards. That's not going to be a problem. They're going to love to send you one. But at least while you're trying to work this process of one, breaking that cycle like you were talking about, and then two, like actually getting out of debt. Once we get deeper into that process, then we can, you know, consider bringing the credit cards back in. But until we're at that point, like there's no way to like resist the temptation if they're right in front of you. Until you've built up like the self-control to use your credit cards appropriately, like you just can't have them in front of you, you know? And so I don't know. I feel like I've always get pushback on that. It's like, well, you don't need to cut them up. I'm like, you don't have to close them. I agree with that because that might, you know, damage your credit. But I would also rather you close the accounts if you know, like, I'm just going to keep ordering the credit cards and then it's just, I'm going to be stuck in that cycle. You know, I'd rather let's fix what's right in front of you first, and then we can focus on bringing in these extra layers to your finances.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Nick. I think when people, you know, often ask me, how do you get out of debt? This is, you know, in a roundabout way, not using your credit cards is probably like one of my first, you know, sort of go-to answers, which is stop accumulating debt, right? Like you said, if you don't have the behaviors to use a credit card appropriately, then it's time to just set them aside while you're working your way through this journey. Otherwise, like you said, you're just filling up a tub that's when the faucet is still running. So, you know, I think that the biggest thing is, you know, you're going to have to change something, right? Like this is probably going to be the hardest step. You know, you've got your budget in line, but honestly, this is a lot of behavior change and a lot of change like in your actions. So I think this is probably the biggest change. If people make this, they will start to notice like, you know, like a dent in their debt payoff journey. But this is probably the hardest part because this is going to take a lot of like action and change on somebody's part. So yeah, I think this is the good first step, and it's going to be a hard one, but in the long term, month after month, this one's going to be the one that has the biggest impact.
Yeah. And I love that you said that, like, something's going to have to change. Like it's as simple as that, right? Like, you know, what you've been doing hasn't been working. And so you got to do something different. And I think that's where you can kind of tell the difference between the people who will get out of debt versus the people who say they want to get out of debt, because the people who will get out of debt are like, all right, what do I need to change? Now it's just about identifying it, versus the people who just want to get out of debt. They're like, well, you know, how do I get out of debt without changing my lifestyle? Like, I want to keep things the same. I just want to be out of debt. It's like, no, the things you are doing is why you're in debt. But yeah, I think, like you said, things got to change if you want something new. All right, but let's jump into tip number 2, which is to pick a strategy and stick with it. And I think once you've stopped accumulating debt, like you have to do that first before you can actually start to make a plan. But once you've stopped accumulating the debt, now we can actually get into the nitty gritty of how do I want to actually pay off my debt? And, you know, in general, I would say there's 2 methods to do it. There's the avalanche method and the snowball method. So the avalanche is you're paying from highest interest rate down to lowest interest rate. The snowball is kind of the flip side of that. You're paying from lowest balance up to highest balance. And, you know, if you go on like Reddit and you type in like, what's the best strategy to pay off my debt? There's going to be like a war, like a forever war of like, which one's the best strategy? There's pros and cons to each of them. I always like to say like the best strategy is the one you're actually going to stick with. And the truth is like, there are pros and cons to each. So you really just got to find the right strategy that works for you, like what's going to motivate you to get out of debt, and just stick with it. But, you know, I feel like when it comes to almost anything in personal finance, like people can kind of get stuck in this, like this mode of analysis paralysis, where they're like, well, there's so many options and so many ways I can do this. Like, what do I tackle first? Why do you think people kind of get stuck in that mode?
Like you said, there's so many different things out there. You could Google this and you'll get 1,000 different answers in both directions. So I feel like that's a big part to it. And I feel like that, that happened to me too. Like, what should you pay off first? You're going to get a bunch of answers this way, a bunch of answers the other way. But really it comes down to what's going to keep you motivated in the long term. Yeah. So I feel like the debt snowball method is best for people who are going to need those quick wins. So if you're paying off like a bunch of different credit cards or a bunch of different loans, I feel like the snowball is probably going to be your best bet because you're going to see some quick wins. At least that's what I see with people. So if you're working on a credit card that's maybe $900 or maybe and then a credit card with like $2,000, you're going to get that $900 one paid off pretty quickly. If you're taking all of that extra money that you have and you're putting it towards that first debt, and then you're like, on that path and you're getting more motivated because you're seeing some of these smaller debts start to fall off. So I feel like the debt snowball is mostly like psychological. Obviously the debt avalanche, you're attacking the ones with the highest interest first. So, that's more of a math equation, but people are humans and, there's a lot of psychology that goes into it. So I feel like that's why sometimes the debt snowball just might be better. So in my example, of my debt-free journey, I actually paid off my car first because there was like a small amount on my car. And then I had, like a big chunk of student loans. So I chose to do the snowball method just so I could be like, yes, I'm done with my car. And now I have my student loans to run after. And then inside those student loans, I sort of went, at the end of my journey, I was paying them off during the 0% interest during COVID. So I sort of picked like the smallest amounts of debts inside there and paid those off individually. And then I started to do the snowball inside of my student loans. So that's sort of my strategy. But I feel like, you're going to have to pick the one that is going to motivate you in the long term and maybe not so much about the math, like whatever's going to be best for you.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Lauren, I always have this rule of thumb. So tell me if you agree with it. But I always tell people if the balances are similar, then focus on the highest interest rate first. Versus if the interest rates are similar, then focus on the lowest balances first. I think that's kind of one way that you can kind of pick between. Like if you're stuck in that analysis paralysis, you can kind of pick which is going to be the best option just by following a simple rule of thumb like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I also kind of follow in my situation, I didn't have like a high interest debt like credit cards, but sometimes if people have like student loans or a car and credit cards, I think that's some pretty common ones. I typically recommend like paying off their credit cards first, unless it's like an abnormally large amount where it wouldn't be worth it. But sometimes I'm like, let's just like kill that debt with the most, the highest interest first. So sometimes I lean towards that too.
Yeah, 100%. Like if someone has high interest debt and then some low interest debt, I'm like, let's get all the high interest debt out of the way first. Then we can kind of make a plan to tackle the lower interest debt. But I completely agree. But I think where people tend to get stuck is they see their debt as like one big pile, right? They don't see the individual sources of debt, and then that's going to help them create a plan for which is going to be the best, what's going to be the best debt to tackle first, right? They see this pile of debt, and it could be between the car, the credit cards, the student loans, a medical bill, whatever it is. And because they don't see it like for each of the individual debts that they are, when they have extra money and they're like, you know what, I want to pay down some debt, they just kind of throw it randomly. And like, it's like taking a dart and just throwing it and seeing where it lands, and every time they find themselves with a little bit of extra money, they're throwing it. I've seen a lot of people, they're like, well, at first I started paying down this, and then I didn't want to ignore this other one, so I started paying down that. And it's like, they haven't really made any progress because they haven't focused in on one single debt. And I think that's kind of the big point here is like, it doesn't matter what strategy you pick. Like you can get into the nitty gritty details of each of them. The biggest thing is put your debts in some order that makes sense just in your mind and focus on that first one, right? Like make the minimum payments, of course, but attack the first one with any extra income you can. Like I always like to say, like, sell stuff around the house that you haven't used. Yeah. Lauren, I don't know if you told me this or if I just heard it somewhere, but like the 90-90 rule, where it's like, if you haven't used something in the last 90 days, and if you haven't, then will you use it in the next 90 days? If you said no to both of those questions, like you probably don't need it, Now, the one thing is like, if you have like big sweaters and it tends to snow like a couple months out of the year, like that's the only exception to the rule. But like, yeah, if you got to just find ways to free up extra income and then focus on one debt at a time. I think that's going to be the best. That's going to be the best strategy.
Oh yeah, for sure. I was gonna double down there on the, I always see people like, okay, I'm just going to pay a little bit here. And I have this tax money that's coming. I'm going to pay this off and I'm going to try to, put this money over here. And it's like, that is not working. It's just, you're spreading out a little bit around to each and you're not making any progress that's meaningful progress, right? Like you might be making a little bit, but it's not enough for you to feel anything. So yeah, I think the biggest thing here is, which you've already touched on, but just to reiterate, like when you're listing out your debts, we're only focusing on one right now. So the rest, I don't care what they are. I don't care if it's 29% credit card interest. Like if it's not your first debt, then you're just going to pay the minimum on it, even though it's scary. Yeah. I think a lot of people are concerned about like, well, this debt is so high interest. Like I can't just pay the minimum on this, but it's like, okay, you have to trust the process, because if you focus on this first debt and put, like you said, put all of your extra money towards this first debt, you're going to see that start to spiral and pay off. And then you're going to be moving on to the next one. And it's going to start to snowball, which is why it's called the snowball method. It's going to start to snowball really quickly. And that's such a good thing. So yeah, I think the biggest thing in here is like pick a strategy and actually stick with it and stop spreading your money all over the different place. Trust the process. It will work.
Yeah. And I feel like sometimes I always like to recommend to people like a hybrid approach where it's like, hey, look, if you find that you're kind of like, I want to get out of debt, I just don't know that I can, like you're in a really tough financial situation for a lot of people who are stuck in that place. It's like the confidence, the motivation, those things are low. And so if you can focus on, hey, let me just attack the smallest debt I have, even if like mathematically it doesn't make sense to pay this one off first, let's just focus on it, pay it off. You'll get that win under your belt. Maybe you do like the next smallest one. Now you actually have some confidence and you have the belief in yourself. I can pay off debt. Then we can find the most mathematically optimal route to continue moving forward. But I always like to tell people like, look, if math was like the biggest concern here with your finances, you wouldn't be in debt in the first place. And so let's focus on like a plan that's going to help you build up the motivation and confidence. Then we can start to focus on like the most optimal route forward. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's it for me. Like pick a strategy, stick to it. And like you said, put the plan in place and then trust the plan. Like for a lot of the stuff when it comes to your finances, this stuff doesn't happen in a month or a few weeks, a few months or whatever. For a lot of people, this is a 12-month, 24-month, 36-month plan to get out of debt so that they can completely change what their financial situation looks like. All right, taking a quick break from today's episode, Lauren and I have some exciting news we'd like to share with you. If you're feeling stuck with your finances and don't know where to start, we have you covered with our one-on-one financial coaching.
These are no strings attached coaching sessions that you can sign up for today. No ongoing commitment. You simply book a session whenever you need one.
Each call is 90 minutes, and by the end of it, you'll have a clear budget to work with and a solid plan to start paying off your debt. Plus, we'll make sure you walk away with some awesome tools to keep you on track, including our budget dashboard and expense tracker, as well as our debt payoff optimizer.
And the best part, you'll get to work with both of us on the call. Together, we'll help you develop the best possible strategy forward, answer your questions, and make sure you feel confident about managing your money.
So if you're ready to get a handle on your budget and kickstart your financial journey forward, check out the link in the show notes to book your first session.
We can't wait to get started with you. Now, back to the episode. Yeah, Nick, this reminds me of my debt payoff journey. So, before I started this, I was throwing money at my student loans. And of course, you're trying, that's usually a large amount. So you're trying to put as much as possible. But I also had my car on the side. So I was just paying that like sort of minimum payment there. But whenever I did the debt snowball, my car was first. So I stopped paying extra on the student loans, just paid minimums there, and took all that extra money and put it towards my car. And I was like so shocked at how fast my car was paid off. I think at the time, I can't remember how much I had left on my car, maybe like $5,000 to $7,000. But because I was putting all of that extra money towards it, I want to say I had it paid off within like the first like 9 months, just because I was throwing so much extra towards it rather than putting it towards my student loans. And then that went away. And then all of that money that I had that I was putting towards my car, I just rolled it into my student loans then and was able to start, chucking away at that. And then my whole debt-free journey, I paid off like $52,000 in less than 3 years, which was absolutely insane because I was only making like $48,000 to $50,000 or something like that. So, this really does work, especially whenever you focus on the smaller debt and, let the snowball sort of do its work.
Yeah, the snowball effect of when you're paying off debt, like that's why, sometimes I tend to lean towards the snowball method, because if you can free up minimum payments, you start to get a little breathing room too, but then you can actually put more money towards your debt monthly. And then, maybe when you first start out, you're like, I can only throw $300 towards my debt. But by the time you get to that last debt, maybe you have like an extra $1,000 in your budget to start putting towards debt. Like you feel like a real badass doing that. And then the cool part about it is if you've continue to roll those payments, whatever the goal is after you get out of debt, you're going to know I can use that same amount towards that next goal. If it's to build up an emergency fund, if it's to save for a vacation because you just sacrificed for the last 3 years and that's what you want to do next, awesome. Like, you know, you have this huge chunk of money that you've been living without. And so it can go towards your next goal. Or, you know, maybe you want to balance things out a little bit. But like, that's what I think is the cool part. Like you said, is like that snowball builds up. And then you're throwing a ton of money at that last step. But what do you think? Should we move into the next one?
Yep.
Cool. So I think this one's kind of underrated, but tip number 3 is to create a payoff timeline. And you know, I think people kind of forget this tip because they look at their debt and they say, all right, this is going to be the plan. You know, like I got my budget in place. This is my plan. I'm going to focus on these debts here. But I think the accountability piece kicks in when you can actually say, all right, from my budget, I know I can put an extra $500 a month towards my debt. Now I should put that into like a little equation. All right, I have this much debt left. Here's how much I can throw at it per month. How many months should it take me roughly to pay off? Because that's going to help keep you accountable. And then like, if you actually have a timeline, you can start to project that into the future and plan for the future. If you know it's going to take me, 18 months to get out of debt, what do I want to be doing after that? In a year and a half, what am I going to start focusing on next? And then if I know now that I can use this money to pay off debt, I can, like I said, you can put that towards the next goal. So I don't know. I think creating a payoff timeline, like that to me is such a big one, because I like for people to see, I like them to see like, hey, if you just keep doing things the way you're doing them now, it's going to take you 5 years to get out of debt. If we move some things around, it could take you 2 years. And then they start to build up that motivation of like, all right, well, if I, drive Uber Eats at night, or I pick up a second shift, or I work overtime, like now I'm going to be actually be able to get out of debt in a year. So I think it's a huge part to like the motivation and the level of confidence when it comes to getting out of debt.
Yeah. And I will say this is a piece to my journey that I sort of missed, honestly. I did, the first step of, taking on no more debt. That was golden for me. Creating the plan of the debt snowball, perfect. But the payoff timeline was actually something that I neglected during my journey. It was like at the very end, whenever I realized that like I could actually put this into like a calculator and figure it out. I just don't think I had the knowledge. There's a really cool tool out there. It's totally free. It's a debt payoff calculator. Just Google debt payoff calculator by Vertex 42, I think. That's like a really cool tool that you can do, like Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets. But you can put in like your different debts, the interest rates, how much you're paying on it, and then how much you're going to snowball, like that extra amount of money that you can put towards them every month. And it'll literally give you a date, a month and date that you'll actually be able to pay all those off. So that is something super important. But like I said, I didn't do this. I think I was just confused because I was like, well, I know my debts are still accumulating interest, so I don't know what this is going to look like. My student loans at the time, in interest alone, I was paying like $4,000 like for the first year, I think, of my journey. So I was like, I don't know how that's going to translate to me getting to be able to pay this off, right? So for me, I didn't calculate this till the very end whenever I found that calculator, and because my student loans were at 0%. So then I was able to do it kind of on my own. But yeah, this is a piece that I think a lot of people miss. And I think, the first two are great, but this one actually gives you like the broad view of like, oh, I can actually get this done super quick, and I can manipulate these numbers to be able to pay it off faster. So yeah, this is definitely an underrated tip here.
Yeah. And what you said, that second part of manipulating the numbers, like sometimes, I'll show someone this calculator, we'll put in all their information, and they see like, oh man, it's going to take me, 3 years to get out of debt. And that's a long time to be stuck in like this tight budget, to be throwing all your extra money towards debt, working an extra job, whatever it is. But the cool part is when you start to, like you said, manipulate those numbers and you show them, all right, hey, if we can squeeze a little bit more out of the budget by cutting expenses, or if, you guys can sacrifice a little bit more by working, a few extra hours or whatever it is, now you can cut that down to 2 years or a year and a half. And so it shortens the amount it shortens the length that you need to sacrifice for. Yeah, you might need to sacrifice a little bit harder, but in my mind, like I'm always a big believer, like I would rather the pain be greater for less amount of time than the pain be moderate for a really long time. To me, I'm like, let's just get it over with, and I find that can be motivating for a lot of people too, where it's like, hey, I don't want this to take 3 years. Cool. Then what can we actually start doing? And that's where the motivation starts to build up there.
Yeah. And I think people are really surprised, even if you put in like a couple $100s extra, which a lot of people can find in their budget if they're really spending on things they don't need to be. If you put a few $100s extra in like the debt snowball calculation or the debt payoff calculator, you'd be surprised how many months, sometimes even a year, that it'll cut off the overall timeline of your debt payoff. So it's definitely something to look at as you're going through this journey, because I think, it might feel like a long time, like, oh, here I have this plan to pay off this debt, but I don't know how long it's going to take me. It's going to be forever. But then you look at the calculator and you're like, oh, if I paid an extra $200 a month, which I can do, then I'm going to pay this off like months sooner. And it's like so much more motivating in that sense.
100%. I think that's a huge part of it. And for me, it's also just like the accountability part. Like I mentioned in the beginning, like if according to this calculator, right, if you plug in all the numbers, if I can do this in a year, let's just say 12 months from now, like if I don't, why didn't I do that? Or on the flip side of that, what do I need to continue reinforcing in my spending behavior and in just what I'm doing on a daily basis? Maybe that's just a simple thing. Like I was just talking to someone today. It's like, you got to just pack a lunch and bring it to work every single day, because, going down to the little shop right outside of your work and spending $20 a day on getting a lunch with all your friends. Like, I know that that's fun, but that's going to make this journey take so much longer. And if you can cut out the little things like that, like that's where the accountability piece comes in with doing something like this, because you can see this is how long it should take me if I stick to a plan.
Yeah, for sure. I, whenever I used to like post on Instagram a lot more, I was doing a series where people would actually like fill out a Google form and give me like all their numbers, and I would put it into the calculator for them and like create a reel and say like when their debt payoff journey would be, or their debt like payoff date would be. And they were super excited because they never, again, like I think people have like the knowledge, like the plan they need to follow, but they often don't have the timeline. So yeah, it's super cool to see like when your actual date is going to be.
Absolutely. Now, I kind of wanted to include like a bonus tip here. And you had mentioned this towards the beginning, but I do think it's really important to like to really emphasize this. Like we had talked about, like the budgeting is kind of like the groundwork there that you need to lay to make sure that these other tips are actually, you have success with them. I think an even bigger part is like having that big vision, the big dream, the big goal, whatever it is. And like when I'm talking to someone, it's like, I want to get out of debt. Why do I want to get out of debt? Why do you want to be out of debt? Well, I don't want to have to, I want my budget to be a little bit easier. Like I want to free up some income to do these other things. Okay. But like, why, like you got to get down like layer after layer to why you want to do this. And, it might be like, well, I want to be able to provide a better life for my kids, or I want to just stop feeling so stressed out every single morning or every single, end of the day. Like it's the debt is the last thing I think about when I go to bed and the first thing I think about in the morning. Like you got to have a very clear vision and reason for why you want to get out of debt, for why you want to do anything with your finances, your health, your relationships, or whatever it is. Like focusing in on that why, I think, is going to be the biggest part. Yeah.
Plus one to that. And I think, the goal has to be like specific, and I feel like it has to bring like out emotion in you. Cause like I said, you're not going to stick with something that's like, oh, I just want to get out of debt. For what? Who cares? Like when in a month, when the process is hard and you're working that part-time job to be able to toss more money towards it, you're not going to stick with it. Right. So it has to be, what are those SMART goals? Like, I forget what it all stands for, but like, is it like, I forget.
Specific, measurable, action.
Yeah. Something like that. But that's
realistic and timely.
Yes. That's like what I think about for these is like, you have to have something that like means something to you. So, I feel like for me, it was more like of the emotional sense, like that's really what kept me going. Cause I was just like, these are the reasons why I want to do this. And it means so much to me that I'm not just going to like go out and like, blow money on something random because I knew I had such bigger goals ahead of me.
I looked up SMART goals just so we get it right. Specific, measurable. I was right there. Achievable, relevant, and time bound. So that specific part, right? Like knowing exactly what the goal is. Measurable, like you can actually assign a time to it or a date to it. Achievable, like this isn't something that's crazy for you to achieve in the time frame. Relevant, like this goal has to be for you. That's one I think people always get confused on. Like you got to find a deeper reason for yourself for wanting to do this. And you could, I think for a lot of times, especially like parents, they might say like, well, I want to do this to provide this future for my kids or whatever. Yeah. That can still be a goal for yourself because you want to be able to do that for your kids. And then the last one is time bound, like having a specific amount of time that you want to achieve this goal. I think if you can attach your why to all these different metrics here, like it's going to be super clear. Because the problem is when people say like, well, I want to get out of debt, like that's just it. That's the goal. I just want to I want to pay off $20,000 of debt, or I want to save up 10 grand. Well, the next time you're confronted with something that's like very attractive, like going out to eat or going with your friends on this vacation or whatever, right? Like that thing is going to be so much more attractive than, well, I want to pay off 20 grand of debt. You know, but if it's, I want to pay off 20 grand of debt so that I am no longer stressed out because my hair is literally falling out. And then therefore I can then pay for my kids' college down the road. Now it's like, all right, I can say no to that vacation or whatever it is because the goal, the reason, the thing I'm aiming for, now that is so much more like attractive in your mind. You want to frame it in a way where you're like, I really want to get to that.
Yeah. I feel like if you don't have like a specific goal or a strong goal at that, any YOLO moment, you're like, whatever, it's fine. I'll pay off my debt when I pay off my debt, but like you only live once, you know, I'm going to go for this. But when you actually do have those goals that mean something to you, that goal means more to you than like this YOLO experience. So yeah, totally get that.
100%. And like, that's exactly like what my wife and I did. Like our goal for like 3 or 4 years was like buying a home. And I remember distinctly, like we sat down one evening and we were both like, all right, is this really the goal? And we were both like, yeah, it is. And then it was like, okay, like how bad do we actually want to do this? Why do we want to do this? What is this going to mean for us, 5 years, 10 years later down the road? And it was like, all right, we both came to the agreement that if this is really the goal, we're going to have to learn how to say no. And it's not saying no to everything, but it's saying no to enough things to where you can actually make meaningful progress, and then being very selective to the things that you do say yes to. Because I think people can get stuck in that saying yes to everything, even when something is really, really exciting versus something that's only kind of exciting. It's like, yes, still say yeah to the really, really exciting things, but learn how to say no to things that don't meet those criteria or those thresholds for you in your mind. That way you can actually free up some money to make the progress there. All right, this was a short episode, but we really wanted to be straight into the point about actual tips that you can follow that are going to make a meaningful difference when you're trying to get out of debt. But as always, if you found some value from this, if you got any laugh out of it, the best way you can help us grow is by subscribing and sharing this with a friend.
Yeah, and if you want to have your money question answered on the show, you can visit our website, justanothermoneypodcast.com, and click the submit a question button. And don't forget to join us for the next episode of Just Another Money Podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations provided on this podcast are for entertainment purposes only and do not constitute professional financial advice. Any financial decisions you make based on the content of this podcast are your responsibility. We strongly recommend consulting with a licensed financial advisor or other qualified professional before making any significant financial decisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that we are not liable for any financial outcomes.